The morning Gerald told her she had until Friday, Clara Mae Whitfield was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes that were not hers. Not her breakfast she hadn't eaten yet, but Gerald's and Nadine's, the plates still holding the warmth of the eggs she had risen at 6 to cook. The mugs ringed where she had poured their coffee before either of them came downstairs, the way she had done every morning for 4 years without being asked and without being thanked. She heard Gerald come in behind her. She heard his particular silence before he spoke, the kind that meant something had been rehearsed. "Mom, we need to talk about the house." She turned off the tap, dried her hands on the dish towel, turned around. She was 76 years old, and she looked it, not in the way people mean when they say that unkindly, but in the way of a woman who has worked steadily and long and carries the evidence of that in the deliberate care of her movements and the lines of her face. Her hair was white, kept short. Her eyes were a clear, patient gray. Gerald was 51 and had his father's broad shoulders and his father's habit of not quite meeting your eyes when he had something difficult to say. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who had been bracing for this conversation for some time. "What about the house?" Clara said. "If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you." The house was not Clara's. That was the central fact of everything that followed. It had been Robert's house, in the sense that Robert's name was on the deed, and when Robert died 4 years ago after a brief and merciless decline from a cancer he had refused to discuss until it had progressed well past discussion, the house passed to Gerald as sole heir. Clara had not contested this. It had not occurred to her to contest it. She had been married to Robert Whitfield for 48 years, and she had not spent those years thinking about what would happen to property when one of them died, because she had spent those years thinking about other things. Raising Gerald through the years when he required it. Tending the house through the decades when it needed her most. Working 20 years as a pharmacy assistant at Draper's Drug in the town of Calder's Mill, North Carolina, where she had earned a reputation for knowing more about what was on those shelves than most of the pharmacists who rotated through, because she had been paying attention since childhood and had never quite stopped. Then spending the 15 years after that caring for Robert's mother, a woman named Vera who had been difficult in her health the way she had been difficult in everything and whom Clara had cared for without complaint, because that was simply what you did when someone needed caring for. Then, at the end, caring for Robert himself through the 18 months of his illness, which she had done with the same steady attention she brought to everything. Sitting beside him through the treatments, tracking the medications, managing the pain schedule with the precision of someone who had spent a career behind a pharmacy counter and understood what the numbers meant. She had not accumulated independent assets. She had accumulated the kind of life that does not show up on paper. When Robert died, Gerald had come to her with what he described as a practical arrangement. He and his wife Nadine would move into the house, maintain it, ensure the property taxes were paid, and the place was looked after. Clara would continue to live there in the back bedroom. She would have everything she had always had: her home, her garden, her routine, her mornings. It was presented as a kindness. It was framed as a son taking care of his mother. Clara had accepted it the way she had accepted most things in her life, not without thought, but without drama. She packed Robert's clothes for donation the week after the funeral, a task she had given herself because sitting with it would have been worse than doing it. She let herself fall apart for exactly one evening, alone in the kitchen after Gerald and Nadine had gone to their hotel, and then she stopped and made a list of what needed doing and went to bed. For the first year, the arrangement was not comfortable, but it was manageable. Nadine had opinions about the house that differed from Clara's in nearly every particular. The curtains that Clara had chosen in 1998 and that Robert had always liked were replaced within 2 months of their arrival. The thermostat was reset to a temperature that saved on the heating bill, and that Clara spent the winter in an extra cardigan to accommodate without saying anything. The dinner hour shifted 30 minutes later, then an hour, to suit Nadine's work schedule, which meant that Clara, who had eaten supper at 6 o'clock for the better part of her adult life, adjusted and said nothing. She cooked. She cleaned. She tended the garden Robert had started 30 years ago, the rose bushes along the south wall, the vegetable beds along the fence line that she expanded each spring because it gave her something to be responsible for, something that answered directly to her care. On the mornings she felt her absence most keenly in the house, the house that now belonged to her son and his wife, and through which she moved with the careful quietness of a woman who understands the terms of her own residency. She went to the garden and put her hands in the soil. She did not complain. This was not stubbornness. Complaint requires an audience willing to hear it. And Gerald, she had understood gradually and then all at once, heard her less with each passing year. He was not cruel to her, not in the way that leaves marks. He was simply absent in the way that some people are absent while remaining physically present, his attention elsewhere, his patience thin in ways he probably didn't notice because she never pushed against it. Nadine was different. Nadine was present and deliberate. And Clara had come to understand, in the slow accumulating way you understand things you would rather not, that Nadine's position on the arrangement had shifted over the course of 4 years in ways that were specific and purposeful. The signs had been there in the months before Gerald appeared in the kitchen doorway. The comment about the back bedroom needing to become a home office, made once over dinner and then not mentioned again, but not retracted either. The afternoon Nadine brought home a woman named Patrice who was identified as a real estate friend and who moved through the house with the particular attentiveness of someone making professional assessments. The morning Clara came down to find the papers from Robert's estate in a different order than she had left them in the hall drawer, as though someone had been looking at them while she slept. She had noted each of these things and said nothing, and continued making breakfast and tending the garden and telling herself she was reading too much into ordinary events. She was good at talking herself back from the ledge of alarm. She had practiced it her entire life. It had not served her this time. Nadine was not home the morning Gerald came to the kitchen. She had gone to her sister's for the weekend, which Clara had taken as ordinary when it happened and understood now was calculated. What Gerald told her took 12 minutes. She knew because the clock on the wall above the stove was directly in her line of sight, and she watched it with the careful attention of a woman determining exactly how much she is being asked to absorb. The house had been listed. Gerald and Nadine were buying a property in Myrtle Beach, something closer to Nadine's family, better weather, a fresh start. They would need the house cleared by the end of the month. He knew this was unexpected. He was sorry for the short notice. He had spoken with a woman at the county senior center about assisted living options in the area, clean facilities, social activities, everything taken care of. He thought Clara would be comfortable there. He thought it might even be good for her, being around people her own age. He said this last part with the earnestness of a man who has convinced himself that what he is doing is reasonable, possibly even kind. Clara looked at her son across the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 30 years and said nothing for a long moment. She was watching the clock. She was thinking about the rose bushes she had pruned every autumn for 3 decades. About the row of seed packets in the kitchen drawer labeled in her own handwriting. About what the phrase clean facility meant when applied to the remaining years of a person's life. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She asked 2 questions. Is there anything in this house that is legally mine? Gerald shifted his weight. We can talk about personal belongings. Furniture, anything you consider yours. And the money from the sale. Will any portion come to me? He had prepared for this question. She could tell by the careful precision with which he delivered the answer, the way people deliver answers they have rehearsed with a lawyer. The estate had passed entirely to Gerald as sole heir. Clara's contributions to the household over 4 years had been, he chose the word carefully, informal, and therefore not actionable in any legal sense, though he intended to be generous about her personal belongings and would be happy to help with the first month at whichever facility she chose. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me yourself." He nodded. He had clearly expected something harder than her quiet. "Mom, I really do think this will be. I'd like to have the morning," she said. "If you don't mind." He left the kitchen. Clara turned back to the sink, turned the tap on again, and finished the dishes. There was a tin box in the back of her closet, tucked behind the extra blankets on the upper shelf, that she had carried from one home to another across her entire adult life, without anyone ever thinking to ask about it. Robert had known it existed. He had known, in the way that attentive husbands know things without being told, that the tin box was important to her in private, and so he had never opened it and never asked her about it. That was one of the things she had loved most specifically about Robert, that he understood the difference between a person's life and a person's everything. The box was painted green, about the size of a shoebox, with a small dent in one corner from a move in the early 80s that she had never gotten around to having straightened. Inside it, she had kept things across 76 years, a letter her mother had written the week before she died, a photograph of Clara at 22 standing behind a pharmacy counter in her white coat looking serious and proud, a folded sheet of paper that turned out on one unexpected rereading to be her and Robert's first lease agreement from their first apartment, and a small envelope that had been in the box since Clara was 12 years old, given to her by her grandfather on a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1960 with instructions she had not forgotten in 64 years. Her grandfather's name was Elias Potts. He had been a small, precise man with thick eyeglasses and ink-stained fingers and the unhurried manner of someone who had decided early in life what mattered and had never seen a reason to reconsider. He ran Potts' Apothecary on Millward Street in Calder's Mill from 1938 until his death in 1971. Clara had spent more of her childhood in that apothecary than anywhere else, perched on a stool behind the counter doing her homework while her grandfather worked, watching him measure and mix and label with the focused care of a man who understood that what he prepared for people mattered in ways they would never fully see. He mixed everything himself: tinctures, salves, compounds that the other pharmacies in the county had long since handed over to commercial suppliers. He maintained a greenhouse behind the shop, a glass structure he had built himself in the early 1940s, where he grew the botanical specimens his formulas required, and he kept journals of everything he made, indexed and cross-referenced in a small, meticulous hand that Clara still recognized in her own writing when she wrote carefully enough. He had been trained originally in botanical chemistry at a college in Virginia before the war changed everything about what a man like him could reasonably expect from a career, and he had brought that training back to Calder's Mill and applied it to the one narrow channel available to him, running a small-town apothecary with the seriousness of someone working on something far larger. He had loved her in the particular way of grandparents who see something of themselves in a grandchild and feel the specific urgency of needing to pass something on before the time runs out. He had taught her the name of every plant in his greenhouse. He had taught her how to read a chemical formula, how to maintain a laboratory notebook, how to be methodical and patient in the face of problems that did not resolve quickly. He had talked to her as though she was capable of understanding difficult things, which she was, and which her schooling in 1960 did not always assume. He had been the one to encourage her toward the pharmacy counter at Draper's Drug when she was in her 30s, telling her that her mind had always belonged in that work, that she had simply taken a long way around to arriving at it. She had not entirely believed him at the time. By the end of 20 years behind that counter, she understood that he had been right. On that Sunday in autumn, when she was 12, Elias had taken a small envelope from his desk drawer and held it toward her with both hands, the way you hold something whose weight is not physical. "Clara Mae," he said, "this is the key to the back room of the shop, the one I keep locked." She had known about the locked room. Everyone in the shop knew it existed. Her grandfather had built the addition to the right side of the original structure himself in the early 1950s, constructed from darker timber than the main building, with an iron-banded door he had sealed with tar paper and a chain. No one had been inside it. When she had asked him about it years earlier, he had said simply that it contained his most important work and that it would keep until it was needed. "I'm giving the key to you," he said, "because I trust you more than anyone else in this family, and because you understand what careful work means." He paused. "Don't open it until you truly need to. You'll know when that is." She had put the envelope in the tin box that afternoon. It had been there since. She sat on the edge of the bed in the back bedroom of the house that was no longer her home, the key in her hand, and she considered what truly needing it looked like from where she was sitting at 76 years old with a suitcase to pack and nowhere to go. She thought about the pamphlet on the kitchen counter, the senior center woman's name at the top of it, the phrase social activities in the description. She got up and went to her closet and began to pack. She took what was hers in the truest sense: clothes, books, the tin box, the photograph of Robert from the nightstand, the small watercolor her mother had painted of the blue ridge above Calder's Mill, which had hung in her bedroom since she was 8 years old and which she was not leaving for a single additional day in a house she was no longer welcome in. She took Horace's food and his bowl and his wool blanket, because Horace was a 15-year-old beagle who had been Robert's dog in name, and had become Clara's dog entirely in the way that animals align themselves with the person who feeds them and sits with them through the long evenings, and she was not leaving him. She did not take the kitchen things, or the furniture, or the linens, or any of the pieces she had used and cared for across 30 years, because they had been purchased with Robert's income in Robert's house, and they now belonged to Gerald. She was not going to make the exit complicated. She was going to make it clean. It took 3 hours. When she was finished, the room looked the way rented rooms look when the tenant has been thorough, as though no particular person had ever lived in it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment, and then she did not look at it again. She found Gerald in the living room. She told him she was leaving that afternoon. He blinked. He had expected Friday. He asked where she was going. "Your great-great-grandfather's apothecary," she said. "On Millward Street." Gerald stared. "Grand's old place has been locked since the 70s, Mom. It's probably falling apart. You can't be serious." "The building is brick," she said. "Elias built it to last. You haven't been inside it in over 50 years. "No," she agreed. "I haven't, Mom." He looked genuinely confused, which was different from concerned. "That makes no sense at all. I'll let you know when I'm settled," she said. She called Horace, and he came around the corner of the hallway at his old, lopsided trot and settled beside her feet. She picked up her suitcase. She looked at her son one more time. She had spent 51 years loving him, and she still loved him in the complicated, unresolvable way of a woman who watches her child become someone she cannot entirely recognize and understands that this changes nothing about the love underneath it. "I hope Myrtle Beach is everything you're expecting," she said. "I mean that." She walked out the front door. The Civic was a 2009 model, bought with her own savings 9 years ago from a dealer on Route 9, one of the few financial decisions she had made entirely on her own terms, and it ran dependably if you did not push it. She put the suitcase in the trunk and Horace on the back seat on his wool blanket and her handbag on the passenger seat and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The house was visible through the windshield. The rose bushes along the south wall had been hers for 30 years, and she had made her peace with leaving them while she was packing, and she held to that peace now and did not let herself revisit it. She started the engine and pulled onto the street. Millward Street was 3 miles east, in the part of Calder's Mill that had been the commercial center when her grandfather's generation was building things, and had been declining steadily since the late 80s as the businesses moved out to the highway corridor and the buildings on Millward were left to accommodate discount storefronts, a pawn shop, a tax preparation office, and the particular kind of vacancy that gathers in streets a town has stopped paying attention to. Clara had driven down it over the years out of a habit that never quite felt like nostalgia and never quite resolved into anything else. She had not stopped. She turned onto Millward from the north end and drove the length of the block. Potts' Apothecary occupied the corner of Millward and Hale at the eastern end, a 2-story red brick building with the name Potts' Apothecary still legible in faded painted letters across the second-floor facade, where the pigment had survived in the shadow of the eaves better than anywhere else. The first-floor windows were covered from inside with brown paper, yellowed now to the color of old newsprint. The front door was oak, solid, with a transom window above it that had stayed intact through decades of weather and neglect. The chimney on the north side had held. On the right side of the building, extending out perhaps 15 feet beyond the original brick structure, was the addition her grandfather had built in the early 1950s. The door was dark timber, banded across with iron straps gone rust brown, sealed along its frame with tar paper that had cracked and gone brittle at the edges with age. A heavy chain was wound across the face of it, fixed with a padlock that had fused to itself with rust into a single solid mass. It was exactly as she had remembered it from the last time she had stood before it as a girl, except that 50 years had given it the quality of something from another era entirely, a door that belonged to a different time, that had been sitting here holding its patience while the street around it changed and forgot it and moved on. Clara parked the car across from it and sat looking. The building was not falling apart. Gerald had said it the way people say things they want you to believe, not from any knowledge but from the desire to redirect you. The brick was sound. The mortar between the courses was weathered but largely intact. The roof, what she could see from the street, had some wear but no visible collapse. Her grandfather had built with the materials and the care of someone who intended for a thing to outlast him, and it had. The street around her was quiet in the mid-afternoon of an October day, a truck idling at the far end, a dog somewhere in the alley behind the pawn shop making itself heard. The light coming down Millward had the particular thinness of late autumn in the Carolina foothills, the year gone gold and lean, the shadows long. Clara reached into her handbag for the small envelope. She opened it and shook the key into her palm. Brass, old, heavier than it looked, with the number 14 scratched into the bow in her grandfather's hand. She had carried it for 64 years and never once put it to a lock. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the sealed edition door with its iron straps and its fused padlock and the tar paper crumbling at the edges around the frame, and she thought about what her grandfather had said on that Sunday afternoon when she was 12 years old, sitting across from him in the apothecary with the late autumn light coming through the windows the same way it was coming through her windshield now. Don't open it until you truly need to. You'll know when that is. She opened the car door. The October air came in cool and carried a smell that stopped her for a moment before she placed it. Old brick, dry leaves, and something mineral and faint beneath those, something that might have been the particular stillness of a building that has been closed for a very long time and is holding what it holds without complaint. She stepped out onto the pavement. Horace scrambled across the back seat, and she helped him down, and he stood beside her looking at the building with the uncomplicated attention of a dog who has decided that wherever his person is going, he is going too. She crossed the street. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Potts' Apothecary and looked up at the faded letters above the second floor, her grandfather's name weathered to a whisper on the brick, still there, still legible to anyone who took the time to look. She was 76 years old. She had a suitcase, a dog, a tin box, $63 in her wallet, and a key that had been waiting longer than she had been waiting. She had been stripped of a house she had kept for 30 years, of savings she had watched diminish across 4 years of living as a guest in her own son's home, of the garden she had tended since before Gerald was old enough to remember it. She had been left with this. She looked at the sealed door of the addition, at the chain wound across it, at the tar paper crumbling at the seams. The padlock on the chain was not her grandfather's. That lock had been added years after his death by her uncle during the settling of the estate, wound on as a precaution against vandalism and then forgotten once the paperwork was filed and everyone moved on. The key in her hand was for the interior door of the apothecary itself, the one her grandfather had installed himself and meant for her specifically. To reach it, she would first need to get through the front entrance, and the front entrance lock had been changed at some point in the decades since. She was going to need a locksmith. She had $63. She hoped that would be enough. She took her phone from her coat pocket and found the number for a hardware and locksmith service she had seen on Route 12 on the drive over. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Potts' Apothecary with her suitcase on the pavement behind her and Horace sitting on her feet against the cold and the key in her hand and the October light going slowly gold around her, and she made the call. On the other end, a man's voice answered on the second ring. "I need someone to open a lock," Clara said. "Old building on Millward Street. I'm the owner." She paused and looked at the brick, at the faded name, at the sealed door waiting patiently in the October afternoon. "I've been away for a while," she said. "I'm coming home." The locksmith arrived 40 minutes later in a white truck with a dent in the passenger door and the name Calder's Mill Hardware and lock printed along the side in letters that had been sun-bleached to the color of old mustard. He was a man somewhere in his 60s, heavy-set, with the particular ease of movement of someone who has spent decades at physical work and has stopped noticing the weight of his own tools. His name, he said, was Clem. He stood on the sidewalk in front of Potts' Apothecary and looked at the building for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Clara. "You said you're the owner." "My grandfather built it in 1938. He left it to the family. I have the deed in my bag." She had found the deed in the county records office 2 days after the divorce settlement. Robert's, not hers. That was a different life, and had carried it in the tin box without quite knowing why she was keeping it close. She knew now. Clem looked at the building again. "I remember this place," he said, not to her particularly, but to the building itself, or to some version of the street that only he could see. "My mother used to bring me in here when I was small. Your grandfather made a salve for my father's hands. He worked the timber mill. The skin would crack in the cold." He paused. "Haven't thought about that in years." "He made it for a lot of people," Clara said. Clem examined the front lock for a few minutes. a mortise lock of a type that had been standard in the 1950s and was still serviceable for his purposes. He had it open in under 10 minutes with a combination of tools Clara couldn't have named, working steadily and without drama. When the door swung inward, he stepped back and let Clara go first. She stood in the doorway and looked. The interior of Potts' Apothecary was dark, the windows covered from inside with the brown paper that had been there since the building was closed in 1971, but the light coming through the open doorway reached far enough into the space that she could see its general shape. The room was long and narrow, with a wooden counter running the full length of the left side, the kind of counter that had been built to last by someone who took the construction of a working space as seriously as the work itself. Behind the counter, floor-to-ceiling shelving still held its original contents, rows of glass bottles and ceramic jars and small tin containers, all labeled in a handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. The ceiling was high. The tin panels her grandfather had installed were still in place, oxidized to a dark pewter but not fallen. The floor was hardwood, deep brown, covered in 50 years of dust that had settled into a layer even and undisturbed, with no footprints in it except for the small trails that something, a mouse or a chipmunk, had left near the base of the shelving along the north wall. There was a smell she could not have described accurately before she was in it, but that she would have recognized instantly anywhere. Old wood, glass and mineral, dried botanical matter, faint and sweet and medicinal, still present in the air after 50 years, as though the building itself had been holding its breath and keeping it. Her grandfather's smell. The smell of Saturday mornings at the age of 9 and 10 and 12, sitting on the stool behind the counter with her homework while Elias measured and mixed. She stood in the doorway and felt something move through her that was not a sound and not a thought, more like a shift in pressure, the way the air changes when a door long sealed is finally opened and the room beyond begins, very slowly, to breathe again. "I'll need to pull the paper from the windows," she said to no one in particular. Clem, standing behind her, made a sound of agreement. "You want me to wait while you look around?" "No," she said. "I'll be all right. Thank you, Clem." She paid him from the $63, which left her with 11, and then she stood on the sidewalk and watched the white truck back out onto Millward Street and turned toward the highway. Then she went back inside and pulled the brown paper from the nearest window. The light came through the old glass in the irregular, slightly wavy way of windows that had been made before the manufacturing process was fully standardized, casting the interior in a quality of light that was specific and unusual, not quite like anything she had seen in a long time. She stood in it for a moment. Then she began to look. She moved along the shelving behind the counter slowly, reading her grandfather's labels. The bottles held what they said they held: dried herbs in various states of processing, tinctures in dark glass, salves in ceramic crocks that had sealed themselves airtight against the decades. He had labeled everything with the date of preparation alongside the contents, and as she moved along the shelf, she was reading not just a record of materials, but a record of time, the years of his working life visible in the careful progression of dates. 1951, 1959, 1963, 1968. The handwriting unchanged across 30 years. On the shelf at eye level, between a row of tincture bottles and a stack of small tin measuring cups, was a framed photograph. She stopped. It was a photograph of herself. She was perhaps 10 years old, sitting on the counter stool with a book open in her lap, looking at the camera with the composed, slightly skeptical expression of a child who has been asked to pause what she is doing and doesn't entirely see why. Her grandfather had taken it. She remembered the camera, a brownie he had kept in the drawer behind the counter and rarely used. She had not known he had kept this photograph, had not known it had been here on this shelf, in this frame, for all the years the building was closed. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she set it carefully on the counter and continued moving through the room. The door to the back was at the far end of the counter, past the prescription workspace where her grandfather's scales were still mounted to the wall, the brass pans dusty but level. She opened it and found the room beyond. A preparation area, larger than she had expected, with a stone sink along the back wall and a gas line that had been capped years ago, and a long work table down the center made from a single slab of maple that had gone almost black with age and use. His tools were still arranged on the wall above the work table. Measures, glass stirring rods, mortars, retort stands, a collection of small copper implements she remembered from watching him work, but could not have named then or now. And on the south wall of the preparation room, shelved between the work table and the back door that led to the greenhouse, were his journals. 23 of them. Identical in format, dark green cloth covers, each one labeled on the spine in his hand with a date range and a subject. They were arranged chronologically, beginning in 1940 and running through to 1970, the year before he died. She touched the spine of the first one and felt the cloth under her finger, intact, still firm. She did not take it down. Not yet. She looked at the row of them for a long moment. 23 years of her grandfather's working mind in 23 volumes, sitting on a shelf in a room no one had entered in 50 years, waiting with the patience of things that have nowhere else to be. Behind the preparation room, accessed through the back door, the greenhouse was a ruin. The glass had gone decades ago, probably in a storm, and what remained was the iron framework her grandfather had built, still standing but overgrown. The beds within converted long since into wild ground by whatever had found its way in through the broken glass. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, at the iron bones of the structure, the particular quality of light falling through the open sky above where the glass had been. She would come back to this. She stepped inside and dug her fingers into the soil near the base of one of the old growing beds, and it was dark and dense and rich from 50 years of composting in place. Whatever had grown here had given back to the ground everything it took. Her grandfather would have found that appropriate. She was back inside the main room when Horace found the door to the addition. He had been exploring the building in his slow, methodical way, nose to the floor, moving from corner to corner with the focused interest of a dog operating on information unavailable to human senses. She had been only partially watching him when she heard the sound of his nails on the baseboard along the right wall, near the interior door she had known was there, but had not yet approached. The door was set into the right wall of the apothecary at the far end of the front room, half hidden by a tall shelving unit that had been moved in front of it. Not to block it, she thought, but simply because shelf space was always in demand in a working apothecary and the space along every wall had been used. She moved the shelving unit aside, which took several minutes, and raised a considerable cloud of dust that sent Horace retreating to the counter with his nose wrinkling. When the shelf was clear, the door was revealed in full. It was solid and dark, made from the same timber as the exterior addition door, with iron straps across its face that matched the ones on the outside. At its center was a keyhole, a simple lock, well-made and old, designed for the key that Clara had been carrying in a tin box for 64 years. She stood in front of it and felt the particular stillness of a moment that has been in motion for longer than you knew. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the key. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She put the key in the lock. It did not turn immediately. The mechanism had not been used in 50 years, and the metal had settled into itself the way old mechanisms do. She applied steady, even pressure, the way her grandfather had taught her to approach anything that resisted, not with force but with patience and the willingness to wait for the right moment. She felt the tumblers move. One, then the second, and then the third. With a click she felt more than heard, and the bolt drew back. She stood in front of the door for a moment with her hand on the iron latch and breathed. Then she pressed the latch down and pushed. The door swung inward slowly on hinges that protested without failing, a sound like something waking from a long and reluctant sleep. Cold air moved out from the room beyond, and with it the smell she had first noticed in the main room was stronger here, old paper and botanical matter and the particular mineral dryness of a space that had been deliberately sealed against the intrusion of time. Clara stepped inside. The room was smaller than she had expected, perhaps 12 by 14 feet, but the use of space within it was what caught her first. Every wall was shelving, floor to ceiling, built from the same dense dark timber as the door and the exterior addition. And on those shelves were her grandfather's botanical collection. Not dried herbs in jars, though there were those too, row on row, labeled with the same meticulous care as everything else in the building. What filled the shelves were specimen cases, flat wooden boxes with glass lids, each one holding a pressed and preserved botanical specimen mounted on archival card and labeled with the specimen's common name. its scientific name, its origin, and the date of collection. The specimens were arranged taxonomically, the way a serious botanical collection is arranged, not by common use or alphabetically, but by classification, family and genus and species, the system her grandfather had learned at college in Virginia and applied here in this sealed room across 30 years of work. Clara moved along the shelves slowly, reading labels. The specimens were extraordinary in their condition. The sealed room had maintained a consistency of temperature and humidity that had preserved the botanical material, as well as the paper and glass, and the plants behind the glass lids were as close to intact as things pressed and mounted 50 years ago could be. Color survived in many of them, the deep green of a fern leaf, the pale yellow of a flowering herb she recognized but couldn't name, the rust red of a bark sample from something she had no identification for. She was still moving along the first shelf when she noticed the table. It sat at the center of the room the way her grandfather's work table sat at the center of the preparation area, as the anchor point of the space, the place where the work happened. It was smaller than the work table, a writing desk of old oak, and on it, arranged with the same deliberate care that characterized everything in this building, were 3 items. A leather-bound ledger, a flat wooden case, the kind used for documents or drawings, sealed with brass clasps that had stayed bright in the preserved air of the room, and a small envelope, unsealed, with a single word written on the front in her grandfather's hand. The word was Clara. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at the envelope for a long time without touching it. Horace had followed her into the room and was sitting at her feet with his chin raised, watching her, the way he had watched her through the long evenings of the past 4 years when she sat in the kitchen after Gerald and Nadine had gone to bed and let herself feel, briefly and without drama, what the days had cost her. She sat down in the chair behind the desk. She picked up the envelope. She opened it carefully, the way you open something you understand you will only open once. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, covered on both sides in her grandfather's handwriting, dated the 15th of October, 1970, a year before he died. She read it slowly. "My dear Clara Mae," it began. "If you are reading this, then the key found its way to you as I intended, and you have come to the shop when you needed it most. I know that is when you would come, because I have known you since you were very small, and I know how you work. You do not ask for help until there is no other road. So if you are here, the other roads have closed, and I am glad I built this one for you." She paused. Her grandfather had been 70 years old when he wrote this. He had still been alive, still working in the apothecary downstairs, still preparing compounds for the people of Calder's Mill with the same deliberate care he had brought to it for 30 years. And he had already written this letter. He had already sealed this room and written her name on an envelope and placed it on this desk, understanding that the time would come, not knowing when, but certain enough of it to prepare. She kept reading. "What is in this room is my life's work, the part of it that mattered most to me and that I chose not to share until the right time. The botanical collection you are looking at represents 30 years of fieldwork across 12 states. I have been careful and thorough, as you know I always am, and I believe it to be the most complete private collection of Appalachian medicinal botanicals in existence. The university in Asheville wrote to me 3 times in the 1960s asking whether I would consider donating it. I did not. I kept it for you." Clara looked up at the shelves. She looked at the rows of specimen cases, at the careful labels, at the scope of what her grandfather had assembled across 3 decades of work. She looked at all of it and began to understand, in the slow and total way that understanding sometimes arrives, the weight of what she was reading. She returned to the letter. "In the wooden case on the desk, you will find the documentation. My field journals, the systematic records of collection and preservation methodology, the correspondence with the university botanists who verified my identification work, and the agreements." She paused at that word. In 1967 and again in 1969, she continued reading. "I was approached by a pharmaceutical company from Raleigh, a firm called Meridian Sciences, regarding 2 of the plant-derived compounds I developed from specimens in this collection. They wanted the development rights to both formulas. I negotiated an agreement with their representative, a careful and detailed agreement covering both an initial payment and ongoing royalties from any commercial products developed using those formulas. I signed the agreement in June of 1969. The initial payment was made to a bank account in my name. I have kept the documentation of all of this in the wooden case. I did not tell your uncle about it when I prepared my estate. I want you to understand why. I knew he would move immediately to liquidate it. I knew he would sell the collection, sell the agreements, take the money and divide it, and it would be gone within a year. I did not want it gone. I wanted it kept intact and given to someone who would understand what it was and use it the way it deserved to be used. I chose you. I chose you because of the way you sat on that stool behind the counter doing your homework when you were 9 years old, asking me questions about every compound I made and not being satisfied with simple answers. I chose you because you are like me in the ways that matter. Clara set the letter down on the desk. She pressed her hands flat on the surface, the old oak worn smooth from decades of use, and sat without moving for a long time. Outside the sealed room, through the door she had left open, she could hear Millward Street, occasional traffic, a wind pushing against the front windows, the buildings settling around her the way buildings settle when the temperature drops toward evening. She had not thought about the evening. She had been inside this building for the better part of an afternoon, and she had nowhere to sleep and $11 in her wallet and a 15-year-old beagle at her feet. She picked up the letter and read the rest. The agreements with Meridian Sciences are still active as written. I have no reason to believe the company has ceased to exist, and the legal language of the agreement does not include a time limit on the royalty arrangement. It is possible that payments have been accumulating in the bank account since my death. I don't know what you will find when you look into this. I don't know what the world will look like when you read this letter. I only know that I built this room carefully and sealed it against time, and that what is in it is real and thorough and documented, and that it is yours. There is one more thing. Clara turned the paper over. His handwriting continued on the back, smaller now, as though what remained was harder to write than what had come before. I know something of what your life has looked like from the outside, he wrote. I have watched you give everything you have to the people around you and receive very little in return, and I have watched you do this without complaint or bitterness because that is your nature, and I have loved your nature, but I have also worried about it. A woman who gives everything away eventually finds herself with nothing of her own. I wanted to make sure that when that moment came, and I believed it would come, I wanted to make sure there was something waiting that was entirely and only yours. Nobody took this from you. Nobody knew it was here to take. You are not finished, Clara Mae. You are simply ready to begin. Your grandfather, Elias Potts. October 15th, 1970. Clara sat in the chair in the sealed room of her grandfather's apothecary on Millward Street, and she let herself cry. Not quietly, not with the careful restraint she had practiced across 48 years of marriage and 4 years of living as a guest in her own son's house. She cried the way she had cried only once before, the single evening after Robert's funeral when Gerald and Nadine had gone to their hotel. The way you cry when you have been carrying something too heavy for too long, and someone has finally, without judgment, taken it from your hands for a moment so you can feel what it was like to put it down. Horace put his chin on her knee. She kept one hand on him and cried until she was done, and when she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat up straight and looked around the room. The light through the door from the main room was going gold and low. It was late afternoon, moving toward evening, and the temperature in the building was dropping. She had the wooden case, the ledger, and the letter. She had 23 journals on the shelves in the preparation room. She had a botanical collection that her grandfather had described as the most complete private collection of Appalachian medicinal botanicals in existence, and she had no means of immediately verifying what any of it was worth beyond the weight of her grandfather's word, which in her experience had never once needed verification. She also had no bed, no blankets, no heat source, and $11. She addressed these problems in order. There was a narrow folding cot in the storage closet off the preparation room, which she found by opening every door until she had seen everything the building contained. It was a military-style cot of the type that had been common in the 40s and 50s, the canvas still intact and the frame still sound, which she set up in the preparation room near the south wall where the last of the afternoon light came through the window above the stone sink. She found 2 wool blankets on the shelf above the cot, folded and undamaged, that smelled of the cedar blocks her grandfather had tucked between them, still faintly present after all these years. She made a note of what she would need from the hardware store on Route 12, a battery lantern, candles, a portable propane burner if she could afford one after the other expenses, basic food supplies, a water jug for the days before she could determine whether the building's water line was operational. She did the arithmetic in her head, and then on the back of the envelope her grandfather's letter had come in, and found that $11 would cover approximately none of this, and that she would need to call her bank in the morning about the account she had held in her own name since 1987, the one she had opened independently and contributed to in small amounts across the years without ever drawing from it, because she had never quite needed to. She knew its approximate balance. It was not a large amount. It was enough. She heated soup on the small propane camping burner she found in the trunk of the Civic among the emergency supplies Robert had packed for her when she first bought the car, and that she had never unpacked, and she ate it sitting at the work table in the preparation room with the wooden case in front of her and the letter beside it, and the 23 journals on the shelf to her right. Horace ate his dinner from his bowl on the floor, and then came and leaned against her ankle in the way he did when he had decided the situation was acceptable. Through the small window above the stone sink, Millward Street was quiet. A car passed once. The streetlight at the corner came on at some point, and its light came through the window at an angle that fell across the wall of journals and lit the spines and the dates her grandfather had written there. 1940 to 1943, 1944 to 1947, all the way to 1968 to 1970. She pulled the last journal from the shelf, the one from the final years of his working life, the years in which he had written a letter to his granddaughter and sealed a room and built a door and left a key in an envelope with instructions for exactly the moment she was living in now. She opened it to the first page. The entries began on the 3rd of January, 1968, written in his careful, unhurried hand, and the first one described a morning walk along the ridgeline above town, where he had found a stand of plants he had been looking for since 1962, a particular species of native botanical that he had read about in a monograph from the 1890s and had reason to believe had significant and undocumented properties. He described the plants in exact detail: height, leaf structure, root formation, the quality of the soil in which they grew, the orientation of the slope. He described the light. He described the silence. He wrote as a man who understood that the work mattered and that the record of the work mattered, and that both would outlast him and needed to be made carefully. Clara read for an hour before the lantern she had retrieved from the car began to dim. Then she closed the journal and set it beside the wooden case and lay down on the cot under her grandfather's wool blankets, still in her coat, with Horace at her feet. The building made sounds around her. The particular sounds of old structures at night, the settling of joints and the movement of air through gaps in the window frames, and the occasional tick of the tin ceiling panels contracting in the cold. She had grown up hearing buildings make these sounds, and she found them now not frightening but companionable, the way a house speaks when it has been lived in long enough to develop a voice of its own. She thought about her grandfather sitting at the desk in the sealed room on the 15th of October, 1970, writing a letter to a granddaughter who was 32 years old and living in this same town with a husband and a son and a job behind the pharmacy counter, writing to her as though he could see through the 44 years between his handwriting and her reading of it. She thought about the agreements with Meridian Sciences, the royalty arrangements he had described. She did not yet know what those agreements contained in full. She did not know whether the company still existed, whether the agreements had survived the passing of her grandfather's estate, whether 50 years of unpursued royalties added up to something real or to a promising path that had been quietly closed by time without her grandfather knowing it would be. She did not know, yet, what was in the wooden case. She knew that tomorrow morning she was going to open it and find out. She closed her eyes. Horace shifted at her feet. The streetlight on the corner of Millward and Hale sent its light through the window in a thin bar that crossed the ceiling above her and lay there steady and unchanged through the night. She was 76 years old. She was sleeping in her grandfather's apothecary on a military cot under cedar-scented wool blankets with $11 in her coat pocket and a key she had been carrying for 64 years still in her hand because she had not been able to bring herself to put it down. She was not frightened. That was the thing she noticed before she fell asleep, the thing that surprised her a little even as she recognized it. She was cold and she was tired and she had no clear picture of what the next week looked like, let alone the next month. But fear was not what she felt. She felt the same thing she had felt standing in the doorway of the sealed room for the first time, that shift in pressure, that sense of a space that has been waiting, beginning slowly and with considerable patience, to breathe again. She slept better than she had slept in 4 years. The morning came gray and cool through the window above the sink, and Clara was awake before the light had fully arrived, which was her habit and had been her habit all her life. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling of the preparation room and listened to Millward Street waking up outside, a truck, someone's radio, a door opening and closing somewhere down the block. Then she got up and started the day. She opened her bank account on her phone and looked at the balance. It was $14,231, accumulated across 30 years of small, consistent contributions to an account she had opened in her own name and her maiden name, Potts, in 1987, when something in her had understood, without being able to name it clearly at the time, that a woman ought to have something that was only hers. She had never touched it. She had never shown it to anyone. She thought about the irony of being the granddaughter of Elias Potts and not recognizing until now how completely she had inherited his particular habit of building things in secret against a need that had not yet arrived. She called the bank, then a plumber about the water line, then the hardware store on Route 12 about a propane heater of sufficient size for the preparation room. She wrote the expenditures in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and tracked the balance and did not allow herself to feel anxious about what remained, because anxiety about resources she was managing carefully had never once improved the management of them. By mid-morning she had heat, running water from the building's line, which was operational once the plumber had cleared a blockage in the main feed, and a list of 9 tasks for the week, arranged by priority, written in the small, precise hand she had not recognized as her grandfather's until this morning. Then she sat down at the desk in the sealed room and opened the wooden case. The brass clasps released cleanly. She lifted the lid and looked at what was inside. Her grandfather had organized it the way he organized everything, by category, by date, each document in its own folder with a label on the tab identifying its contents. There were botanical survey records, the field documentation for the collection on the surrounding shelves. There were correspondence files, her grandfather's letters to and from university botanists, professional societies, the occasional government agency. There were legal documents, the original deed to the building, filed in 1938, a property tax record running unbroken through to 1971, and near the front of the case, in a folder labeled Meridian Sciences, Agreements and Correspondence, 1967 to 1970, was what he had told her she would find. She lifted the folder out and opened it. The agreement was dated the 12th of June, 1969, 15 pages of dense legal language in a typeface that told her it had been drafted by someone who took contracts seriously. She read it slowly, the way her grandfather had taught her to read anything that mattered, beginning to end, without skipping. She was not an attorney. She had never had occasion to read a contract of this kind before, but she had spent 20 years working in a pharmacy where she read pharmaceutical documentation daily, and she was not intimidated by technical language, only careful with it. By the time she reached the last page, she understood the broad structure of what she was holding. Her grandfather had granted Meridian Sciences the development rights to 2 botanical compounds, identified in the agreement as MC-14 and MC-31. In exchange for an initial payment and a royalty arrangement structured around any commercial products developed using those compounds. The royalty rate was specified clearly. The term of the agreement was not limited by a fixed expiration date, but by the commercial lifespan of the applicable products. The initial payment had been made. That was documented in the correspondence file, a letter from Meridian Sciences dated July of 1969 confirming the wire transfer. Whether any products had been developed in the subsequent 50 years, and whether any royalties had been paid or had accumulated unpaid, she did not yet know. That would require finding out whether Meridian Sciences still existed, and whether the agreement had been honored, and what the products, if any, had generated. She set the folder down and sat for a moment. Then she reached for her phone and searched for Meridian Sciences, Raleigh, North Carolina. The search returned results immediately. Meridian Sciences had not ceased to exist. It had, at some point in the 1980s, been acquired by a larger pharmaceutical firm based in Charlotte, which had in turn been acquired by a national company in the late 1990s, and that company was still operating. The original Meridian Sciences division still existed as a subsidiary, retained largely because of its portfolio of specialty botanical-derived compounds, which had become more rather than less commercially significant as the pharmaceutical industry's interest in botanical medicine had grown steadily across the past 3 decades. Clara sat with her phone in her hand and looked at the folder on the desk in front of her and felt the specific, weightless vertigo of a woman who has just understood that what she is holding is not a historical document, but an active one. The people who built this thing had not stopped. She picked up the phone again and this time dialed information. It took her 3 calls to reach the right department, and she was transferred twice and put on hold once. And she waited through all of it with the patience of a woman who had worked 20 years behind a pharmacy counter and understood that the people in the middle of a bureaucratic chain are not the ones you need, and that you simply have to move through them steadily until you find the right door. The third person she spoke to was a woman named Andrea in the contracts and licensing department. Clara told her clearly and without preamble that she was the estate heir of Elias Potts, the original signatory of a licensing agreement executed in June of 1969 regarding compounds MC-14 and MC-31, and that she was calling to determine the current status of that agreement and any related financial matters. There was a pause on the line of a type Clara recognized. The pause of a person encountering information they were not prepared for and needing a moment to determine how to respond. "Can you hold briefly, Mrs. Potts?" Andrea said. "Whitfield," Clara said. "My married name is Whitfield, but I can hold." She waited. Horace came and sat beside the desk and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke. Through the door of the sealed room, through the length of the preparation area and the main room of the Apothecary, Millward Street was carrying on in its ordinary mid-morning way, indifferent and unchanged. Andrea came back on the line. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, and her voice had changed in the way voices change when the information they are about to convey is significant. "I'm going to need to connect you with someone in our legal department. Would you be available for a call this afternoon?" "I'm available," Clara said. She set her phone down on the desk beside the Meridian Sciences folder and looked at the room around her. The botanical specimens in their glass-lidded cases, arranged with 30 years of patient care. The 23 journals on the shelf in the preparation room behind her. The letter in her grandfather's hand on the desk in front of her, turned face down so she could think without reading it again, though she did not need to read it. She had already committed it to memory the way you commit to memory the things that change the way you see everything before them. "Nobody took this from you," he had written. "Nobody knew it was here to take." She picked up her small notebook and added one more item to the list of tasks for the week, at the top, above everything else, in letters slightly larger than her usual hand. "Call back, Meridian Sciences Legal Department, 2 p.m. Then she closed the notebook and looked at the open wooden case and at the rows of specimen boxes on the shelves and at the journals and at the letter and at the photograph she had brought in from the main room. The one of herself at 10 years old sitting on the counter stool with the book in her lap, and the expression of a child who has not yet been told that the things she is learning in this room will turn out to matter more than anyone around her could have anticipated. She was not finished. She had not even begun. The attorney from Meridian Sciences was a woman named Patricia Holt, and she called at 2 o'clock exactly, which told Clara something useful about her before she said a word. Patricia did not waste time. She explained that MC-14 and MC-31, the 2 compounds covered under Elias Potts's 1969 agreement, had both been developed into commercial pharmaceutical products by Meridian's parent company. MC-14 had entered the market in 1981 as a component in a topical anti-inflammatory preparation that had become a moderately significant seller in the specialty pharmacy market. MC-31 had proven more consequential. Developed more slowly and released in the mid-90s, it had become the basis for a botanical-derived compound used in a line of respiratory preparations that had grown steadily in the decades since and were now sold in 34 countries. The royalty arrangement Elias had negotiated in 1969 covered both. It had never been voided, never been legally superseded, never been challenged. When the original Meridian Sciences was acquired in the 80s, the agreement had transferred with the rest of the company's intellectual property portfolio. The accounting department had been sending royalty payments to a bank account in the name of Elias Potts of Calder's Mill, North Carolina, since 1982. The account still existed. No one had drawn from it in 50 years because no one had known to. There was a pause. Mrs. Whitfield, Patricia said carefully, I want to be direct with you about the account balance, because I think you should be sitting down when I tell you. I am sitting down, Clara said. The figure Patricia gave her took a moment to fully arrive. Not because Clara was slow, but because some numbers require a second pass before the mind accepts them as real. 50 years of royalty accumulation from 2 commercially active compounds, compounding with the bank's interest arrangements across those decades, had produced a balance that Clara wrote in her notebook in her grandfather's precise small hand and then looked at for a long time. Is there a legal process for transferring the account? She asked. There is, Patricia said. It's not complicated. You have the original agreement, the estate documentation, and your established identity as the heir. We can facilitate the verification on our end. I'd estimate 4 to 6 weeks to complete the transfer. Thank you, Clara said. I'll be in touch. She set the phone down. She sat in the chair in her grandfather's sealed room with the number in her notebook and his letter on the desk in front of her, and the October light coming through the open door from the preparation room, crossing the floor in a long bar that reached the base of the specimen shelves and touched the lowest row of glass-lidded cases with a pale, steady gold. She stayed still for several minutes. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began making a list of what needed doing. The weeks that followed had the quality of work that knows exactly what it is for. She hired a structural engineer who told her the building was sound from foundation to ceiling tin, needing attention but not rescue. She hired a contractor from town named Willis who turned out to have known Elias by reputation and who approached the restoration of Potts' Apothecary with the seriousness of someone working on something worth preserving. The greenhouse framework was salvageable. The growing beds beneath it, enriched by 5 decades of decomposition, were richer than any soil she had worked. She ordered glass for the greenhouse roof and spent 3 mornings on her knees in the beds, turning the soil and planting the first of what she intended to grow there. Clem from the hardware store replaced every window in the building. The tin ceiling was cleaned and sealed and began again to reflect the light the way it had in her grandfather's time. The counter in the front room was stripped and oiled, and the shelving behind it was restored, the bottles and jars cleaned and returned to their places, the labels still legible, her grandfather's handwriting still present in every room. She had his photograph framed properly and hung it above the counter where she could see it while she worked. She applied to have the building listed on the county historical register. The botanical collection, assessed by a professor from the university in Asheville who drove up on a Tuesday and spent 4 hours in the sealed room going very quiet, was confirmed to be exactly what her grandfather had said it was. The professor used the word significant several times and then stopped using it because it was clearly not sufficient. Gerald arrived on a Saturday in December, 6 weeks after she had moved in. She heard the car on Millward Street before she saw it, and she was behind the counter in the front room when the door opened and he stepped inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. The restored shelves, the clean tin ceiling, the warm light from the 2 new fixtures Willis had installed along the ceiling. The counter where Clara stood with her hands resting on the freshly oiled wood. The photograph of Elias above her shoulder. He opened his mouth. The building is mine, Clara said pleasantly. Held in my maiden name, transferred directly from my grandfather's estate. The property tax records show continuous ownership. I have had it confirmed by 2 attorneys. He closed his mouth. Gerald, she said, and her voice was even and without heat. The voice of a woman who had already decided exactly what this conversation would and would not contain. I hope Myrtle Beach is going well. I hope Nadine is happy. I genuinely mean that. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had made his breakfast for 4 years and moved quietly through the margins of his house and packed her suitcase in 3 hours when asked to leave. This woman who was standing behind her grandfather's counter in her grandfather's restored apothecary looking at him with the clear, patient gray eyes that had always seen him more completely than was comfortable. He said nothing. He nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they have understood something that costs them to understand. Then he walked back out onto Millward Street, and the door closed behind him. Clara looked at the photograph of Elias for a moment. Then she turned to the notebook on the counter and added 3 items to the week's list. That evening she made tea on the propane burner and carried it to the chair behind the restored counter and sat with Horace at her feet while the streetlight on the corner came on and sent its light through the old glass in that particular irregular way, falling across the shelves and the labeled jars and the carefully ordered evidence of her grandfather's working life and of her own beginning. She was 76 years old. She was home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.